Hi, I'm Eldrick Stoneskin, and the video essay that you're about to watch is part 5 in a series containing my theory surrounding the secret of the Winterfell crypts, and ultimately the key to defending humanity against the coming onslaught of the others. I believe that Azor Ahai, the hero of the first long night, was in fact the male progenitor of House Stark, who after being turned to stone was stored with his army beneath Winterfell to await the return of the others, and in my opinion was also known as the Grey King, a hero whose very skin turned grey as he descended beneath the surface to sit a throne, resurrected and blessed with stone, so that which is dead may never die, but rises again harder and stronger, protected by fell sorceries so they can brandish their burning swords and fight the ancient enemy. And the culture and stories we hear of the Ironborn are meant to inform us of just this, that the Grey King Azor Ahai and his warriors founded House Stark, became statues beneath the surface, and further the idea of this first Stark seeking out a magical woman to either grant this gift willingly or have it stolen from her. So come with me as we attempt to discover the truth around the potential origins of House Stark. But before we begin, I just want to give a huge shout out to Crowfood's daughter from the Disputed Lands YouTube channel, who has some amazing videos around Ironborn myth and legend, with some very similar ideas around Azor Ahai, the Grey King, Greyscale, and protective armor, which I will link in the description below. Her channel is one of the best A Song of Ice and Fire channels out there, and I can't recommend it highly enough. As you're about to see, the symbolism and parallels between the Grey King and the Starks really are direct and numerous, and leads me to believe this Grey King may have been the male progenitor of House Stark, as in my opinion, George wouldn't be including this amount of them if the Grey King wasn't associated with our Grey Kings beneath Winterfell somehow. Firstly, as we discussed in a previous video, the Stark genetic characteristics are said to be grey skin and grey eyes, and amazingly, the Grey King is also said to have grey eyes and developed grey skin, with his beard also being described as being as grey as a winter sea, furthering a connection to our Grey Kings of winter. In fact, Theon, who is a direct descendant of the Grey King, thinks to himself that he is becoming a Stark when his skin turns grey, further suggesting this connection. Another parallel between the two is that both the Grey King and the Starks descend beneath the surface to sit a throne when they die, and interestingly, it's only when the Grey King's skin turns grey does he descend beneath the surface, just as we suspect Azor Ahai, the first Stark, turned grey when becoming stone before descending down into the crypts, further suggesting that this may be the same person. To further this, it's also said that the Grey King has warriors seated on thrones beneath the surface with him too, reminding us of the army of Stone Kings seated beneath the surface on their thrones as well. And interestingly, these warriors of the Grey King are said to be seated on thrones of pearl, the colouring or jewel commonly associated with House Stark. Another deliberate parallel George is showing us is that both the Grey King and Ned Stark, one of our King of Winter characters, married mermaids. Think Ned marrying a Tully, and the sigil of fish symbolically making Catelyn a fishwoman or mermaid. The next parallel is that the Grey King's Hall is presented to us as a giant being turned to stone, and was said to have been warmed by a dragon's living fire, which is very interesting, as the Stark's Hall of Winterfell is also presented as a giant being made of stone, and is also said to be warmed by dragon fire, further suggesting this connection. Another parallel between the Grey King and the Starks is we hear from Euron Greyjoy that men used to be mighty, but men have grown smaller now, suggesting that this Grey King may have been giant in size as well, just as we suspect our kings of winter were larger than average men too. Another connection between the Grey King and House Stark is that we see Theon, a descendant of the Grey King, living in Winterfell as a pseudo-Stark at the start of the series, who eventually becomes the Prince of Winterfell, and amazingly also undergoes a grey transformation too, thinking that he has now become a Stark at last. We even find Theon, after this grey transformation, kneeling in front of the Winterfell heart tree in a dance with dragons, asking to be sacrificed by Rowan, one of Mance's washerwomen, and imagines his blood feeding the tree, just as we think the Grey King Azor Ahai did for his sacrifice and grey transformation that Bran witnessed in front of this very tree, while also tasting the blood from within the weirwood, just as Theon thinks his blood will feed the tree as well. It also turns out the Grey King and the Starks both worship weirwoods, the same trees the children worship and we think granted the ability to be blessed with stone and resurrected. We even hear that the Grey King is associated with a tree called Ig, representing a weirwood being a pale tree who seemingly requires human sacrifices. Another interesting point is that the Grey King is said to have taunted the storm god until he lashed down with a thunderbolt, setting a tree ablaze, which is interesting as the Winterfell heart tree is described by Theon as being a blaze of flame, further connecting Winterfell's weirwood to the Grey King's tree that was set ablaze. And amazingly, the castle of Winterfell itself, which has been hit by lightning, is presented to us as a monstrous stone tree, giving us our tree hit by lightning and further connecting the Grey King's weirwood to the Stark's weirwood. There even happens to be a stone Stark in the crypts named by George as Donna Stark, with the name Donna being the old German name for Thor, which meant thunder, associating our stone kings beneath Winterfell with lightning as well. George might even be furthering this idea of stone kings wielding the power of the gods, with some descriptions of some giant nameless stone kings mentioned in this quote as Dany first enters Vaes Dothrak. Beyond the Horse Gate, plundered gods and stolen heroes loomed to either side of them. The forgotten deities of dead cities brandished their broken thunderbolts at the sky as Dany rode her silver past their feet. Stone kings looked down on her from their thrones, their faces chipped and stained, even their names lost in the mists of time, showing us giant stone kings seated on thrones who are nameless like the old gods, capturing the essence of lightning, just as we heard the Grey King did, who is likely a giant stone king beneath Winterfell. And I think this lightning is representative of the power of the weirwoods, a power harnessed by the Grey King so he could rise again, harder and stronger. And I think the reason we see the religion of the drowned god that the Grey King and his descendants worship, and the old gods of the weirwoods and House Stark connected, are because they are actually just different religious mythologies who are in fact worshipping the same gods, the children's old gods of forest, stream, and stone. In support of this idea, we hear that a priest of the drowned god, known as Galon Whitestaff, was known to carry around a staff of weirwood, furthering their connection to the worship of the weirwoods and therefore the religion of the old gods. And amazingly, it turns out the colours of the drowned god are said to be green, grey and blue, which is interesting because if we look to the gods the children of the forest worship, they are said to be gods of forest, stream and stone, which by no coincidence gives us the colours of these two religions aligning perfectly, with green representing forest, blue representing stream or water, and grey representing stone. In fact, Asher directly compares the two religions in this line from the Wayward Bride chapter in A Dance with Dragons. Lady Sibel all but lived in her godswood, praying for her children and her husband's safe return. Another prayer like to go unanswered. Her heart tree is as deaf and blind as our drowned god, further suggesting that these gods might be one and the same. To further this connection between the two religions, we also hear that the drowned god has the ability to turn things to stone, the same ability we saw the old gods being capable of in my last video, which turned the weirwoods to stone. In fact, it's very possible that the ribs of Naga are actually weirwoods, as we hear them symbolically described as the trunks of great pale trees, sounding remarkably like the weirwoods. And knowing weirwoods never die, they just turn to stone, these stone ribs of Naga could actually be ancient petrified weirwood trunks, which would also make the throne of Naga's jaw that the Grey King sits on a weirwood throne, reminding us of the weirwood thrones we see Beric and Bloodraven seated on, our Stonezor Ahai parallel characters beneath the earth. And if this is the case, the drowned god that the Ironborn say turned these weirwoods to stone would indeed be the gods of the children. Before my next point about these two religions actually worshipping the same gods, I have to introduce the concept of the Green Sea that has been in the fandom for quite some time, originating with a forum user named Ravenous Reader and popularised by the David Lightbringer YouTube channel, which is essentially that being beneath the sea is a metaphor for being inside the weirwood realm, being in a state of undeath within the Green Sea. The basics of this concept is that we actually find examples of the trees being referred to as a green sea on several occasions, with this example from A Clash of Kings while Jon is at the Fist of the First Men. When the wind blew, he could hear the creak and groan of branches older than he was. 1,000 leaves fluttered, and for a moment the forest seemed a deep green sea, storm-tossed and heaving, eternal and unknowable. Ghost was not like to be alone down there, he thought. Anything could be moving under that sea, creeping towards the ring fort through the dark of the wood, concealed beneath those trees. We even hear another reference to the forest being a green sea when Asher Greyjoy recalls the story of the children turning the trees to warriors, which we think is a reference to stone warriors being brought forth from the green sea of the weirwoods, which is exactly what we see happen. Flint warriors, led by Azor Ahai, appearing from within the green sea. And therefore, the idea we see in the Ironborn culture of drowning and going beneath the sea to sit their thrones in the watery halls of the drowned god is actually symbolically referring to the idea of greenseers going into the green sea of the weirwoods, residing in the green sea undead beneath the surface so they can be reborn from the trees, harder and stronger. Which might be why the Grey King is said to have married a mermaid, because if the Green Sea is the weirwood realm, then the reason the Grey King married a mermaid to live beneath the waves would suggest that he married her to gain access to her magic and access to the weirwoods, so their sons and daughters, the line of House Stark, could access the magic of the weirwoods as well. And in my opinion, this proto-Stark, Azor Ahai, who became known as the Grey King, was sacrificed and resurrected through the weirwoods by his mermaid wife, while undergoing a grey transformation by turning to stone in a resurrection ritual that the Ironborn still remember and recreate to this day. Let Theon your servant be born again from the sea, as you were, Euron Greyjoy intoned. Bless him with salt, bless him with stone, bless him with steel. Nephew, do you still know the words? What is dead may never die, Theon said, remembering. What is dead may never die, his uncle echoed, but rises again, harder and stronger. As we've just discussed, I think the Ironborn ritual of drowning and being resurrected is a tradition remembered from the first long night, and was in fact a part of the death and resurrection process that our Grey King, Azor Ahai, partook in. Firstly, the person partaking in this ritual is blessed with salt, reminding us of Azor Ahai, who is said to be reborn amongst salt and smoke, with this salt most likely referencing the idea of literally being drowned in water as we see in this Ironborn ritual, which is interesting as we actually hear of a pool of water right in front of the Winterfell heart tree, the location we think Azor Ahai was turned to stone and resurrected, perhaps used to drown the recipient for the first step in this process. Secondly, the participant is blessed with stone, which I think is the idea of the recipient being given Greyscale, blessing them with stone to allow them to be resurrected literally harder than before, which is very possible, as we've already heard the drowned god had the ability to change beings to stone, as we hear in the tale of Naga. And lastly, they are then blessed with steel, which I think is the idea of their throat being slit now that they are drowned, so their spirit can enter the green sea of the weirwoods and allowing that which is dead to never die, so they can rise again in their now transformed bodies, harder and stronger, making them the hard people for hard times required to defeat the others and end the long night. It also seems, after this Ironborn drowning ritual, that it's traditional to give a punch and a kiss to welcome them to the Brotherhood, which is interesting, as when we see Jon Snow die in A Dance with Dragons, our next Azor Ahai who belongs to a Brotherhood, it's described that he was punched in the belly and most likely will be resurrected with a kiss. But the most interesting aspect is the fact that after this ceremony, the revived person dons a rough-spun robe of mottled blue and green and grey, with mottled being the word used to describe Shireen's Greyscale, which I think is symbolic of the idea of this resurrected warrior now being covered in Greyscale after their resurrection is complete, which might be suggestive of our next Azor Ahai, Jon, and his resurrection in the Winds of Winter, who has already received a punch to the belly, will receive a kiss to awaken, and in my opinion, will become mottled by the reawakening Greyscale and rise again harder and stronger after his spirit returns from Ghost, who by no coincidence has the colouring of a weirwood. In support of this idea of the Ironborn drowning process being a resurrection and protection ritual, George gives us this amazing quote in The World of Ice and Fire, in which we hear that the Ironborn are risen from some watery hell, protected by fell sorceries, just as we suspect the Stone Kings to rise from beneath the surface had their skin transformed to stone through magic for protection as well. To further this idea of the Ironborn knowing a magic ritual that allows the recipient to become invulnerable, we also hear of an Ironborn warrior who had magical protective skin. Most infamous of all was Balon Blackskin, who fought with an axe in his left hand and a hammer in his right. No weapon made of man could harm him, it was said. Swords glanced off and left no mark, and axes shattered against his skin. Which also reminds us of another Azor Ahai parallel character, Waymar Royce, and the magical protective armour we suspect House Royce remembers from the first long night. And I think this magic ritual, which made the skin hard and protective, is where the term Ironborn comes from, being reborn with protective skin, making them as hard as iron, and therefore Ironborn, so they may be invulnerable to the weapons of the others. Because as we know, iron is one of the metals of winter, dark and strong to fight against the cold. To further this, we even see several examples of the Ironborn being hard people, just as we saw with the ancient Starks, furthering the idea of them being reborn harder and stronger in these quotes. Some say that the Iron Islands are named for the ore that is found there in such abundance, but the Ironborn themselves insist that the name derives from their nature, for they are a hard people, as unbending as their god. And as Theon is returning home in a clash of kings, we hear this quote as he and the captain's daughter observe Pike. "It must be windy there," the captain's daughter observed. He laughed. "Windy and cold and damp. A miserable, hard place in truth. But my lord father once told me that hard places breed hard men, and hard men rule the world." With cold and damp also being the perfect conditions, it's said for Greyscale. And if windy places make hard people, it's interesting that Theon thinks to himself that Theon did not need to be told that Black Wind was Ash's longship. He had not seen his sister in 10 years, but that much he knew of her. Odd that she would call it that, when Robb Stark had a wolf named Grey Wind. "Stark is grey, and Greyjoy's black," he murmured, smiling. "But it seems we're both windy." Which is interesting, because the wind is said to make hard men, and is often said to be the language of the old gods, which could be symbolically furthering the idea that both these cultures are in fact worshipping the same gods yet again. We even see the Ironborn who have taken Winterfell with Theon described as made of stone in this quote: "I took this castle and I mean to hold it, to live or die as Prince of Winterfell, but I will not command any man to die with me. If you leave now, before Sir Roderick's main force is upon us, there's still a chance you may win free." He unsheathed his longsword and drew a line in the dirt. Those who would stay and fight stepped forward. No one spoke. The men stood in their mail and fur and boiled leather, as still as if they were made of stone. We even hear the concept of a rock king in Ironborn culture, which might be a clever way of George alluding to the first kings of the Ironborn literally having been made of stone. We even hear Balon Greyjoy, an Ironborn king, referred to as a hard man and symbolically being made of stone, in this quote from Theon's first chapter in A Clash of Kings. Balon Greyjoy had always been thin, but now he looked as though the gods had put him in a cauldron and boiled every spare ounce of flesh from his bones until nothing remained but hair and skin. Bone thin and bone hard he was, with a face that might have been chipped from flint. His eyes were flinty too, black and sharp, but the years and the salt winds had turned his hair the grey of a winter sea, flecked with white caps. In addition to this Ironborn king, who has been described as hard and being made of stone, we also find his hair described as being grey as a winter's sea, the same description as the Grey King's hair, and giving us another winter association to remind us of the Stone Kings of winter. We even hear from Euron in A Feast for Crows that this Ironborn king we've seen symbolically made of stone will rise again, harder and stronger after his death. A king will rise. So as you can see, we find a lot of references to the Ironborn as being blessed with stone, so they can rise again, harder and stronger, just as we expect the Grey King Azor Ahai to have done, becoming a king of winter who went into the green sea of the Weirwoods to be reborn, which would make sense as we often hear of the idea that Azor Ahai will be reborn from the sea, potentially meaning the green sea of the Weirwoods. "The darkness will devour them all," she says, "the night that never ends." She talks of prophecies, a hero reborn in the sea, living dragons hatched from dead stone. She speaks of signs and swear they point to me. So maybe the Grey King was Azor Ahai, the progenitor of House Stark, and was turned to stone and reborn from the Green Sea, a stone hero who could challenge the others with his flaming sword. In support of this idea, we find out that the ancient Ironborn, and most likely the Grey King himself, were known for wielding burning brands. When we hear Euron telling Theon that the red comet seen in the sky represents the burning brand of the drowned god, which is interesting as the word brand means both fire and flame, and sword or weapon, associating the Grey King with Azor Ahai and his flaming sword. It's also said that Azor Ahai is to be born again from salt and smoke, which is interesting, as a part of the Ironborn resurrection ritual we've just discussed is to be blessed with salt, which is potentially the idea of being drowned before being reborn. It also seems that when we look to other Azor Ahai parallel characters we've discussed previously, we see a few of them being reborn from the sea as well. Our first example is Dany's Unsullied, who show us one-eyed symbolism, are described as made of stone several times, and are said to bathe in the salt sea as a part of a religious ritual. Our next example is the Titan of Braavos, who appears to have one eye, is a stone man with a broken sword, and wakes from the sea to protect his people. And we also have Beric Dondarrion, who has one eye, is described as if he was carved from stone, has a broken sword, and was interestingly pulled from the water at the Mummer's Ford before one of his resurrections, giving us several examples of a resurrected one-eyed stone warrior with a broken sword meant to represent Azor Ahai being reborn from the sea. And if we look to a major Ironborn location, I think George is further suggesting this Azor Ahai connection to the Ironborn and the Grey King through the descriptive language he uses around the seat of House Greyjoy. And that location is Pike, the household of the Greyjoys, located on the island of the same name. And by no coincidence, as Theon approaches Pike upon his return, George gives us more broken sword symbolism to further hint at a connection between Azor Ahai and the Grey King and his Ironborn, in this quote from A Clash of Kings. The point of land on which the Greyjoys had raised their fortress had once thrust like a sword into the bowels of the ocean, but the waves had hammered at it day and night until the land broke and shattered. Thousands of years passed. All that remained were 3 bare and barren islands and a dozen towering stacks of rock that rose from the water like the pillars of some sea god's temple, while the angry waves foamed and crashed among them. Also notice the inclusion of the waters hammering the land here before breaking, further associating this land shaped like a broken sword to Lightbringer with its forging story and the breaking of the sword. And later in this same chapter, this connection is repeated again when Theon thinks of the land literally as the broken sword, furthering the Azor Ahai association yet again. And I think the reason George is describing the House of the Greyjoys as a broken sword is to hint at Azor Ahai having been the Grey King, an Ironborn hero of the ancient past. And to further this connection, it just so happens we have an Azor Ahai parallel character who is a direct descendant of the Grey King too, and he just so happens to have magical protective armor. And his name is Euron Crowseye. And just like all the other Azor Ahai parallel characters we've seen so far, like Beric, Bloodraven, Waymar and Jon, he is presented as having one eye. This Azor Ahai character also happens to be one of 9 Ironborn brothers, which reminds us of the 9 iron swords on the crown of the Kings of Winter, further connecting this Azor Ahai character to the Starks. Another interesting aspect about Euron we find, which furthers the idea of the Grey King being a common ancestor of both the Ironborn and the Starks, is that Euron also receives visions from the 3-eyed crow as a child, just as Bran Stark did. And seeing as though green seer abilities are said to be genetic, this could suggest an ancient blood connection between the Starks and the Greyjoys, most likely through the Grey King Azor Ahai, the ancient hero we expect founded House Stark. But most amazingly, we find out through Aeron in the Forsaken chapter from the Winds of Winter that Euron, this twisted Azor Ahai parallel character, happens to have magical protective scale armor, which I think is symbolically representative of the magical protective scaled skin we suggest Azor Ahai received for protection and preservation. And amazingly, this magical protective scaled armour happens to have arcane symbols folded into the steel, reminding us of another one-eyed Azor Ahai parallel character, Waymar Royce, whose house remembers an ancient magical armour with runes engraved on the steel to protect the wearer from harm, and also the seemingly magical ice armour that the symbolic one-eyed Jon Snow dreams of in his Azor Ahai dream atop the wall. And I think the magical armour these three Azor Ahai parallel characters are showing us is symbolic of the protective scaled stone skin provided by Greyscale that we think Azor Ahai, the Grey King, utilised to defeat the others. And it just so happens that another of the 9 sons of Harlon Greyjoy, one of Euron's brothers, was actually turning to stone from this disease. The priest had no memory of Quentin or Donal, who had died as infants. Harlon he recalled but dimly, sitting grey-faced and still in a windowless tower, and speaking in whispers that grew fainter every day as the Greyscale turned his tongue and lips to stone. One day we shall feast on fish together in the drowned god's watery halls, the 4 of us, and Uri too. Amazingly, Harlon Greyjoy, an iron-born descendant of the Grey King, is also undergoing a grey transformation and is quite literally turning to stone. And it's specifically mentioned that after this stone transformation, he will reside beneath the surface on a throne, just like our potentially grey-scaled kings of winter seated on their thrones beneath the surface of the earth. Also note that Harlon is said to speak in whispers, a very common term used for the language of the weirwoods and the greenseers within communicating through the trees, associating greyscale transformed men with the magic of the weirwoods. Another amazing fact we discover about Harlon is that his mother happens to be Lord Quelon's first rock wife and a woman of the stone trees, associating a weirwood woman with this greyscaled man. But most amazingly, there happens to be 3 Harlons in the story worth mentioning here, as I think George is tying them all together for a reason, and in my eyes, it's to foreshadow the idea of grey-scaled kings of winter who wake when horns are blown. As in addition to Harlon Greyjoy who is turning to stone, we also hear of a Harlon Stark, who happens to be a king in the north, and would now be sitting in stone in the Winterfell crypts, furthering the connection between the stone kings of the Starks and this magical stone disease. And finally, the third Harlon we hear of in the story is Harlon the Hunter, who happens to be the brother of Herndon of the Horn, not only giving us a horn association with this Harlon, but also moon symbolism around a woods witch that could grant extended life, reminding us again of the weirwood woman in Bran's ancient vision that we think granted this magical ability and the moon and sickle associations tied to her. And as we know, George always picks his names very carefully, and for one Harlon to be turning to stone from Greyscale to sit beneath the surface, another Harlon to sit in stone beneath the surface of Winterfell, and a third Harlon to be associated with horns and the magical preservation of life gifted by a magical woman is by no means an accident. And in addition to this, it turns out that the name Harlon derives from the name Harlaw, which is not only an Ironborn name, but in the real world means mound of hill associated with an army, furthering the idea of the grey stone kings beneath Winterfell being an army under a hill, awaiting the sound of a horn to wake once more. And it seems to further this idea of stone giants waking from beneath the earth, George actually gives us more symbolic environmental descriptions around a large iron-born castle to reinforce the idea of stone giants rising up from beneath the earth, just as we saw with the Fist of the First Men and Storm's End. And that location is Harrenhal, built by an Iron Man named Harren the Black. And interestingly, in A Feast for Crows, Jaime thinks to himself while observing this giant stone structure that it looked like 5 twisted fingers of black misshapen stone grasping for the sky, giving us another example of a stone giant below the earth reaching up from beneath the ground, just as we saw last video with the Fist of the First Men and Storm's End. We also hear from Jaime that the spirits of Harren and his sons still inhabit Harrenhal to this day, giving us generational spirits of the dead. At the same place we find a giant stone hand grasping for the sky, reminding us of Winterfell yet again. And by no coincidence, this place that shows us spirits of the dead and rising stone giants from beneath the earth ended up under the ownership of House Strong, which only furthers this theory. As we've discussed before, the German word for strong is Stark, connecting the Starks to the Ironborn, and this location we see a stone giant rising up from. So as you can see, the Grey King, who underwent a grey transformation before descending beneath the surface to sit a throne, sounds exactly like our Grey Kings of Winter, who sit a throne beneath the surface and I believe underwent a grey transformation also, becoming stone so they can be reborn from the green sea of the weirwoods. And it seems George might be foreshadowing the idea of warriors residing in a realm of undeath through the Ironborn belief of their warriors' afterlife, which is said to be attending a great feast beneath the sea after their death. But what's more interesting is the real-world myth that George seems to be drawing from to influence his warriors sleeping within the weirwoods, and only seems to further our theory. Interestingly, the idea of an afterlife within the religion of the drowned god is to go beneath the waves and into the drowned god's watery halls, seemingly attending a great feast beneath the sea, which I think is symbolically representative of the spirits of warriors residing in the green sea of the weirwoods. In fact, the Winterfell crypts themselves, in which we see warriors seated on thrones beneath the surface as well, is described by Bran as a Hall of the Dead, reminding us of the drowned god's Hall of the Dead, in which its warriors are seated on thrones beneath the surface as well. And just like we hear of the Ironborn attending a Feast of the Dead, we also hear of a Stark Feast of the Dead at Winterfell through Theon's dream in A Clash of Kings, showing us both of these cultures attending a Feast of the Dead in a great hall after they pass away. And I think the reason George is showing us both the Starks and the warriors of the drowned god both attending Feasts of the Dead is because they both come from the same Grey King, Azor Ahai, whose body is currently beneath Winterfell, seated on a throne while his spirit resides in the green sea of the weirwoods, in a state of undeath, waiting to rise up and fight again, in my opinion, by the blowing of a magical horn, which I think is mythicized by the followers of the drowned god as Merlings hailing their lord by blowing into seashells. And it seems the place George drew inspiration from for these warriors attending a feast after death so they may rise up and fight again in a great battle is the Norse myth of Valhalla, which is described as such by Wikipedia. In Norse mythology, Valhalla is the anglicised name for Valhall, or Hall of the Slain. It is described as a majestic hall located in Asgard and presided over by the god Odin. Half of those who die in combat enter Valhalla. The masses of those killed in combat, along with various legendary Germanic heroes and kings, live in Valhalla, feasting on the flesh of a boar slaughtered daily and made whole again each evening, until Ragnarok, when they will march out of its many doors to fight in aid of Odin. Which I think is a good parallel to the weirwoods and my theory involving the realm within the trees, that we expect legendary heroes and kings to be resurrected from to fight once more during the Long Night. And it just so happens that Ragnarok, the battle these undead warriors are called on to fight, shares many parallels with the Long Night as well. If we look to Norse myth, it turns out Ragnarok is also known as the Long Winter, which describes an extended season of winter and extended periods of night, making it a perfect parallel for the coming long night in A Song of Ice and Fire. And if the dead warriors of Valhalla rise up again from their feast of the dead to fight in this long winter, maybe George's undead warriors within the Weirwoods will do just the same. And to further the idea of the Horn of Winter waking our undead stone warriors to defend the realms of men during the long night, it just so happens the Battle of Ragnarok is said to be signalled by the sounding of Heimdallr's horn. Another idea from Norse myth George seems to be drawing from to inspire our stone giant Azor Ahai is Surtur, who happens to be a giant that will lead the giants of Muspelheim during the Norse long winter, wielding a burning sword. Just as we expect our stone giant Azor Ahai to rise up during the long night to battle the others with his flaming sword. But returning to the dead warriors of Valhalla, who we think inspired our stone warriors within the Weirwoods, it just so happens that these undead warriors are led by Odin, a one-eyed warrior who I think inspired George to create his Azor Ahai character deep in the crypts, who I think will rise up again from the Valhalla equivalent within the Weirwoods and lead his army of dead warriors in battle during the long winter. As we've already discussed, Odin is widely known for his one eye, which is the common symbol we see around Azor Ahai parallel characters, just as we've seen with Beric, Bloodraven, Euron, Jon, and Waymar Royce. Odin is also said to have 2 ravens and 2 wolves as his animal familiars, reminding us of the skin-changing and walking abilities that the Starks have and the first Stark, Azor Ahai, would have had as well. In fact, one of the names of Odin happens to be Svipal, meaning changing, fleeting, or shapeshifter, showing us another clear influence that George has drawn on to inspire his Odin character, Azor Ahai. Another parallel between Azor Ahai and Odin is that one of Odin's many names is Draugadrautin, Lord of the Undead, reminding us of the dead warriors we suspect both Odin and Azor Ahai will lead during the long winter, and the Lord of Corpses title that we see attached to the one-eyed character Lord Beric Dondarrion. And amazingly, just as we've seen with our Azor Ahai parallel character Waymar Royce, who shows us protective runic armour, and the Kings of Winter and their runic associations, it turns out that Odin is the god of runes, which is the reason Odin has one eye in the first place, as he sacrificed an eye to gain the wisdom of these magical runes, hanging himself from Yggdrasil, a clear inspiration from the Weirwoods, while staring down into the Well of Erd for 9 days, in a state between life and death to gain the sacred knowledge of the runes, which also gives us the familiar 9 numerology we've seen around the Kings of Winter, the Weirwood Grove, and Euron and his Ironborn brothers yet again. And 2 examples of the power Odin gained from these runes are said to be the ability to wake the dead and protect his allies in battle, the 2 things we expect Azor Ahai to have done, raising an army of the dead who were magically protected from harm. Which is interesting because just as we think runes are somehow involved in Azor Ahai's magical protective scaled skin through the runes on Waymar Royce's ancestral armour and the arcane symbols on Euron's scaled armour as well, it turns out runes of magical protection were a real concept in Norse myth and history too. But I don't think this is the only idea for magical protective skin George is drawing on from the real world, because thanks to Crowfood's daughter from the Disputed Lands YouTube channel and her amazing Ironborn series, which I've linked in the description below, I've learnt about another Norse myth that seems to have inspired our Long Night hero Azor Ahai as gaining invulnerable, scaled skin. And that story is the legend of Sigurd, his father Sigmund, and the legendary sword Gram, which is explained as such by Wikipedia. Gram is primarily seen in the Volsung saga, used by men in the Volsung line after Sigmund. Sigmund receives it during the wedding feast for his sister Signy. Part of the way through the feast, a strange man appears carrying a sword. Although unknown to Sigmund, this is the god Odin. He thrusts the sword into the barnstalker tree that grew in the middle of the hall and said, "The man to pull out this sword from the trunk shall receive it from me as a gift, and he will find out for himself that he never bore in hand a better sword than this." Soon after he departed, every man made his attempt to pull the sword out of the wood. All fail except Sigmund, who easily extracts it. Eventually, after many years, the sword Gram is broken by Odin during Sigmund's final battle. And after the legendary sword Gram was broken by Odin, Sigmund's wife takes the two halves of the broken sword and keeps them for her future son, Sigurd. After many years, a dwarven smith, Regan, comes and begins teaching Sigurd. After a period of time, he tells Sigurd of the mighty dragon Fafnir and the treasure which it guards, asking Sigurd to slay it for him. Sigurd agrees on one condition, that Regan makes him a mighty sword capable of slaying such a monster. Regan confidently makes Sigurd an admirable sword, but when Sigurd sees it, he is disappointed and breaks it over an anvil. On his second attempt, Regan makes him a sword superior to the last, but it also breaks. On his third attempt, Sigurd brings Regan the two halves of Gram, who reforges his father's legendary sword, and when he strikes the anvil with Gram, it is cloven in two. As you can see, this story shares many parallels with Azor Ahai, who has a legendary sword which undergoes 3 forgings, but also reminding us of the ancestral sword of House Stark, Ice, which is now broken in two as Widow's Wail and Oathkeeper, and could hint at its reforging in the future. But the most interesting aspect about Sigurd, and I think the idea that inspired Azor Ahai with his 3 forgings of Lightbringer to have been turned to stone with Greyscale, is the fact that in the process of killing the mighty dragon Fafnir, Sigurd's arm becomes covered in its blood, which magically transforms his skin to become hard, scaled, and invulnerable, giving us a Norse hero whose sword undergoes 3 forgings and ultimately ends up with hard, scaled, invulnerable skin, just as I'm suggesting that Grey King Azor Ahai did, our King of Winter, who gained hard-scaled, invulnerable skin and now resides beneath Winterfell, waiting for his resurrection. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video. As you can see, it's very likely that the hero we know as the Grey King was also Azor Ahai, and founded House Stark, with his warriors seated on thrones beneath the surface of the earth, while their spirits live on in the green sea of the Weirwoods. Once again, I'd like to say a huge thank you to everyone out there for supporting the channel. I've learnt a lot through your comments and have really enjoyed the discussion around this theory and the series as a whole. If you haven't yet and you enjoyed the video, please like, leave a comment and subscribe if you haven't yet, as I'm now researching a follow-up series to this one due to the channel's success. And as always, I'd love to discuss your thoughts, ideas or additional evidence around this theory in the comments below. In part 6, we're going to discuss another figure that George is using to suggest the idea of a stone man being brought back to life, meant to foreshadow our Greyscale Kings of Winter waking from the crypts. And this mysterious figure is Greyscale associated and is said to be a statue who comes back to life. If you know who I'm talking about, let me know in the comments below. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.